Well, thank you all so much for being here today. I'm Anna Gassman-Pines, faculty member in the Sanford School and a faculty affiliate of the Duke Center for Child and Family Policy. And I'm really excited to be moderating today's session. We have two junior scholars presenting work related to housing instability and child well-being. So what we'll do is I will introduce them both first, then we'll hear from one presenter and have some Q&A after that, and then we'll hear from the second presenter and have some Q&A after that. And if we have time, we might also kind of take a step back and have a broader Q&A and conversation if people are interested in that. So it is my pleasure to introduce our two speakers for today. The first will be Dr. Sarah Dickerson, who became an adjunct instructor at the Duke Center for International Development in 2021 and has been a postdoctoral research associate in the Center for Child and Family Policy since the fall of 2019. Her research focuses on the impacts of maternal well-being on children's health. Dr. Dickerson completed her Ph.D. at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy, where she worked as a pre-doctoral fellow at the Brookings Institution and consulted for the World Bank and the Carter Center. Our second speaker will be Warren Lowell, who is a mixed methodologist who studies inequality, families and children, housing, and homelessness. He is a Ph.D. student in the joint degree program in public policy and sociology. Warren combines quantitative analysis of large secondary data sets with in-depth qualitative interviews to produce new evidence on long-standing issues facing poor urban families. He received his Master of Public Policy degree from the University of Minnesota and has several years of policy experience conducting public-facing research at the Tufts University School of Medicine, Future Services Institute, Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, and Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare at the University of Minnesota. And so it is my pleasure to turn the virtual mic over to Dr. Sarah Dickerson.
Well, thank you, Anna, for that lovely introduction, and thank you everyone for attending today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. There we go. All right. So today I'm going to be talking about chronic neighborhood mobility and academic outcomes for public school students in our state in North Carolina. And the research team that worked on this project includes myself, as well as Anna Gassman-Pines, who you just heard from, Beth Gifford, Warren Lowell, and Marcos Rangel. And we received funding from the Provost's Office Collaboratory Grant for this project. So before I get started, I just want to provide a little bit of a background on student mobility. So student residential and neighborhood mobility is not always caused by these negative events, and it doesn't always have negative consequences. So you can have students' families relocating to better neighborhoods and the kids going to better school as their socioeconomic status improves. But we do see that students from poorer households tend to move more frequently than those from advantaged households. And mobility rates are higher among the Black and Hispanic students than their white and Asian counterparts. So we do see from the literature that there is this link between frequent moves and negative academic outcomes. And that can occur because of a couple different mechanisms. So there can be a loss of social capital in these neighborhood networks. So students become isolated from their former classmates and peers, even school professionals. And there's interference with students' routines. So something as simple as how they get to and from school can be disrupted. And with these negative academic outcomes, we're seeing that the highly mobile students are experiencing higher rates of everything from absenteeism to suspension, dropout, worse test scores in math and reading. So you may be thinking at this point, that this topic is pretty well covered in the literature. So where is the gap in the literature? How is our project going to be relevant? Well, a lot of the prior studies on student residential mobility have relied on cross-sectional data, or they've used this chronic school mobility measure as a proxy for chronic residential mobility. But we have this longitudinal data from NCERDC, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later in the presentation, but it shows the cumulative history of mobility, and it really gives us a complete picture of student mobility. And by examining the neighborhood moves over time, we can then capture the impact of these frequent changes in the student's home environment. And so neighborhoods are actually really important when it comes to students, because crossing those neighborhood lines can reshape their entire social environment. And the neighborhood in which they reside is going to impact everything from exposure to crime, poverty, joblessness. And there's also evidence that it's going to impact longer-term economic trajectories. So in carrying out this study, we're capturing an important aspect of mobility, the chronic neighborhood mobility, and investigating its role in shaping these academic outcomes beyond some of these factors that have already been studied, like chronic school mobility or even persistent poverty. So we have a couple different research questions that we set out to investigate. So first, we just wanted to know what share of these public school students in North Carolina are experiencing chronic mobility. And here we've defined that as 2 or more neighborhood moves between the 2010 and 2015 school years. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we decided on 2 or more moves. And we also want to know, how does the share of chronically mobile differ for the Black and Hispanic students compared to the white students? Also, we asked, is chronic neighborhood mobility associated with worse academic outcomes in grade 8? So this includes chronic absenteeism, reading and math Z-scores, so their academic performance. And we're looking above and beyond just chronic school mobility and persistent poverty. And lastly, we are interested in exploring this additional question. And I'll talk about this a little bit more toward the end of the presentation when I discuss our planned analyses. But that is, we just want to know, how does the effect of chronic mobility on 8th grade student academic outcomes vary by race and ethnicity? So now I'll talk a little bit about our data and our sample. So we have yearly data for 6 school years from the North Carolina Education Research Data Center, the NCERDC, which I talked about previously. And that's for the 2010 through 2015 school years. And 58% of students were present for all of these rounds. Our cohort consists of 55,000 students from North Carolina, public school students, who did not have any data missing through these years. And we opted to focus on the three largest racial groups in the state. So that would be Black, Hispanics, and whites. And also, just as a note, the students were in grade 3 in the 2010 school year. All right, so now we can talk a little bit about the measures that are included in our models. So first, I'll discuss some of our independent variables. We looked at chronic neighborhood mobility, as I've been discussing, and that is a binary variable that indicates if the student experienced 2 or more moves across census blocks between the 2010 and the 2015 academic years. So why did we choose these 2 or more moves to define this measure? Well, we wanted it to parallel our chronic school mobility measure. And that was a binary variable that was developed by Goldhaber et al. In a recent publication, indicating that if a student experienced 2 or more non-structural school moves between academic years, they were considered chronically mobile. Now, non-structural moves just means that the move occurred outside the student's natural progression through the education system. So a move between elementary school and middle school, for example, wouldn't count towards a non-structural move. We also opted to include an interaction term just to capture those students who may have experienced both chronic neighborhood mobility and chronic school mobility. And then we have our dependent variables, our academic outcomes. And so here, that includes first our math and reading Z-scores, which just measure the standard deviations from the mean end of grade math and reading test scores in grade 8. And we also have our chronic absenteeism, which is a binary variable that indicates if the student was absent 10% or more of the 8th grade academic year, which would be 19 or more days during a 185-day school year. Okay, and I wanted to take a minute just to talk about what we mean by neighborhoods here. So we're really talking about something akin to census blocks. And the size of a census block is typically between 600 and 3,000 people. And just a little bit of background information, they're not delineated by the population size. As you can see, they can vary in geographic size. They also can't cross county lines or water boundaries. And the number of census blocks that we have in our sample is around 75,000. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to our analysis, which involved a couple of different things. So first, just our descriptive overview of neighborhood and school mobility, and that includes neighborhood mobility by race and ethnicity, and also an overview of some of the covariates included in our models. We also ran regression models to investigate relationships between chronic neighborhood mobility and then our academic outcomes in grade 8, which again are just those math and reading Z-scores, as well as chronic absenteeism. So we've been talking about this a little bit as a team, and our regression results are certainly interesting, but we think that our descriptive results on their own could make a pretty valuable contribution to the literature. So here we were just looking at the share of students that switched census blocks in a given year on average, which was 14%, and also the share that were chronically mobile, which was pretty substantial, so 21%, about a fifth of students. And like I mentioned, we also wanted to examine neighborhood mobility by race and ethnicity. So again, we looked at the share that switched census blocks for a given year on average, and we see that that share is highest for Black students, followed by Hispanics, and then white students. And a similar pattern emerged with the chronic mobility rate. So here we see that the rate is definitely highest for Black students, followed by Hispanic students, and then white students. We also wanted to provide an overview of school mobility. So we looked at the share that switched schools in a given year as well, on average, which was about 8%. So a lot lower than the share that switched neighborhoods on average, as well as the share with chronic school mobility. So just 2 or more non-structural school moves, and that was 11%. So both of these percentages we see are lower than what we were finding for neighborhood mobility. So for anyone who's interested, we also looked at the count too for both school moves and neighborhood moves. And there were a couple of things that stood out to me here. The first of which is what I just talked about with chronic neighborhood mobility and chronic school mobility. So there are more students who had 2 or more neighborhood moves than 2 or more school moves. I mean, we also see that even the maximum number of moves is greater when we're looking at neighborhood mobility than school mobility. And then finally, another thing that stood out to me was that the share of students who never switched schools was greater than the share who never relocated to a new neighborhood. We also wanted to provide some descriptive characteristics, just taking a look here at the covariates that were included in our models. And these are baseline characteristics from grade 3 for the students in our sample. And here you can see that we included whether the student was an English language learner, had a disability, persistent poverty. And the measure that we use there for persistent poverty just captures whether the student was eligible for free or reduced lunch every year between grades 3 and 8. And that was a definition that was developed by Susan Dynarski at the University of Michigan. We looked at sex, so percent male, as well as age at the beginning of grade 3, and then just the racial breakdown, so percent Black, Hispanic, and white. And as we can see here, this is for the entire state, so a little bit over 50% of the students were white. So now we can move on to looking at chronic mobility and some of our academic outcomes. So here, as you can see, if you look at this table, it's structured in such a way that first we looked at the relationship between neighborhood mobility and the Math C scores, and school mobility and Math C score, and then finally both measures of mobility, neighborhood and school, as well as an interaction term in that third column. And what we see here is that neighborhood mobility is associated with the lower Math C scores above and beyond that relationship between school mobility and Math C scores. So we don't see any additional impact of being chronically mobile on both of those dimensions. So that interaction variable in the third column, but we are certainly seeing this negative association between neighborhood mobility and Math C scores. So we also looked at reading Z-scores as well. And as you can see, this table is set up similarly to the previous table. And we note here as well that neighborhood mobility is again associated with lower reading Z-scores above and beyond that relationship between school mobility and reading Z-scores. And we also can note that the effect that we observe here of mobility, it's slightly smaller for reading than it was for math on the previous slide. And again, we're not seeing too much happening on that interaction variable. So finally, we wanted to look at chronic absenteeism, which again was a binary variable. So here I wanted to include a couple different options, different ways to look at this relationship. So I included an odds ratio table as well as marginal effects. So first here, just looking at these odds ratios, we see that neighborhood mobility is associated with increased odds of chronic absenteeism. So we also look at marginal effects and see something pretty similar in that neighborhood mobility is associated with the increased probability of chronic absenteeism. It's small, but it's certainly there. There's increased probability, increased likelihood of chronic absenteeism. And again, we're not seeing too much happening with that interaction term. So we can't claim that there's additional impact of being chronically mobile on both dimensions. But we are still seeing that there is this relationship between neighborhood mobility and chronic absenteeism where there is higher probability. Okay, so next I just wanted to spend a moment to talk about our planned analyses and some of the steps that we would like to take next. So as I mentioned before, we're certainly interested in analyzing chronic mobility's effect on 8th grade student academic outcomes according to race and ethnicity. And this is just going to mean examining the differences in test scores and chronic absence between Blacks and whites, as well as Hispanic and white students, and then figuring out the extent to which that chronic mobility, that chronic neighborhood mobility helps explain those gaps. And we've done something similar for a previous paper, so I think we can draw upon some of that work to inform our next steps with these analyses. So that is all from me, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And Before we turn to our next presenter, we're gonna just have a few moments for Q&A. You can use the raise hand function and raise your hand, and I'm happy to call on you if you'd like to say your question out loud. If you'd prefer to put it in the chat, that would also be fine, and then I will read out the questions that come in through the chat. Jane, go ahead.
Thanks so much. That was a really great presentation, Sarah. I'm wondering, so you use census block groups, and I know a lot of neighborhood papers use, or you use census blocks, and a lot of papers use census tracts, and maybe some use census block groups. I'm wondering if you have a sense of whether, are you seeing more moves by looking at a more micro level? Are people moving blocks within census tracts or block groups? And then maybe just a little bit about how you chose to look at census blocks.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best way to answer that is that was the unit that we had available. And so it's actually, calling it census blocks isn't even 100% accurate. It's more a pseudo census block. But I think if we were able to do that and look at different sizes and units, that is certainly something that could be included in the analysis.
Question that came in through the chat. Clara is wondering, how were students' moves to charter schools considered?
Yes, and so ultimately we didn't end up including charter schools in this specific analysis. So we can talk a little bit more about that, but essentially it didn't really make sense to include them because of a couple of restrictions just with the data. So we're not accounting for those there, but we are hoping potentially as we get more data in that that's something that can be adjusted as we move forward.
Other questions for Sarah? Well, if you think of something in the meantime, please feel free to put it in the chat, and I will be happy to turn to it at the end during our time for broader discussion. But seeing no more questions coming in through the chat right now, nor hands, I'm going to turn the floor, the virtual mic, over to Warren Lowell. Warren.
Thanks, Anna. 1 second, I'm just going to share my screen. Oops. All right, can everyone see that? Cool. Thanks, Anna. So I am also presenting today. I'm presenting on a paper actually uses very similar data from totally different state and asks a very different question. And so my hope with sharing this paper alongside Sarah's is that we can get a little bit of a different flavor of what we can do with administrative data from public schools. So my paper that I'm presenting today is called Who Counts? Educational Disadvantage Among Children Experiencing Homelessness and Implications for the Different Systems that Serve Them. So this research project actually came out of during my master's, my time doing my master's at Minnesota. There was a Grand Challenges research initiative, basically prompting professors across the university to tackle big, difficult questions. And one of the questions that the team that I was a part of was, how do we try to solve student and youth homelessness? And so I worked with my master's advisor at the time, Maria Hanratty, and this is joint work with her. And when I joined this team, one thing that kept coming back into my mind was that it was really interesting to me that we actually define homelessness differently depending on what federal department is providing services to children. So The Department of Housing and Urban Development has one definition of homelessness that is pretty strict comparatively to other departments. And basically, if you are residing in a place that is not meant for habitation, including emergency shelters and transitional housing, you are considered homeless by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Crucially, this does not include what we refer to as doubled up homelessness, which is when individuals and families share housing with others, maybe friends or family members, due to a loss of housing and economic insecurity. On the flip side, the Department of Education actually uses a much broader definition to capture homelessness. And in order to fall under this definition, if you are lacking a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, you are considered homeless by the Department of Education. And so again, the crucial difference here is that this includes families who are doubled up. And so I started to think about why, well, this is very interesting and why does this matter? And this graph, I think, tells one big reason why it matters. It matters because they tell different stories about youth homelessness, both their scale and also how they've been changing over time. And so you can see this is borrowed from Andrew Sullivan's recent paper in Urban Affairs Review, where he also talks about these different definitions. And as you can see, students who are ed homeless or considered homeless by the Department of Education, both are a much larger number. I mean, starting in 2007, almost 3 times as large, and have been growing over the past 10 or so years and have continued to grow since 2017. Whereas children considered homeless by HUD have been, that number has been pretty stable over the past 10 or so years. Another reason this really matters is because services rendered for children experiencing homelessness are different depending on whether they fall under those definitions or not. So if you interact with HUD's homelessness services system and they determine that you are homeless, you receive a needs assessment and then a range of short to long-term housing supports through a triage system, depending on that needs assessment. If you are not considered homeless by HUD, but are considered homeless by the Department of Education, and also children who are identified as by HUD. So under this broader definition of homelessness, I should say, the Department of Education renders you are eligible for the subsidized meal program. If you do not already receive it, you're eligible for customized transportation to and from school if you have moved and need a new bus route. And there are also tutoring and other education supports available to children who fall under this broader definition. But crucially, the Department of Education and the schools that identify these children do not provide housing services. So the rub, or the big question that I sort of started to think about, is that this resource prioritization scheme is efficient if we think that HUD homeless children have greater needs than those who are doubled up, because we know that HUD has significant resource limitations. But we also know that doubled up families face lots of unique challenges that are unique to doubling up and different from staying in shelters. So for example, there's a lot of instability that comes from staying with friends or family for undefined periods of time. There's a lot of uncertainty and stressors that come from that. And then also there's recent research that shows that these families tend to be pretty institutionally disconnected, and some refer to them as flying under the radar. And with interviews with school staff have even reported that they sort of consider students who are doubled up having fewer needs than those who are in shelter, and as a result are less willing or less inclined to provide connections or referrals to other services. So this is important. And actually, there's also little research drawing direct inferences about the relative disadvantages faced by children who fall under these two definitions. And so that's the aim of my project that I'm presenting to you today, is to try to provide new insight into that relative disadvantage. And so the big question that I'm interested in asking is, how do school outcomes compare between children identified as homeless through HUD's strict definition of homelessness versus those who fall under ED's broader definition? And sort of the big question here is the exclusion of doubled up children from HUD's housing services justified given the educational disadvantage these children face relative to other children experiencing homelessness? So as part of this fellowship that I mentioned earlier, one of the really wonderful benefits was I was able to work with the Center for Advanced Studies for Children's Welfare, conjecturally, or known as CASHU, the beautiful acronym name. And one of the amazing things that they have at their disposal is a really remarkable data linkage system. And for this project in particular, they linked data from HMIS, or the Homelessness Management Information System in Minnesota, to the MARS automated reporting student system, which is basically a large database of all public school students in the state of Minnesota, very similar to the NCRDC data that Sarah mentioned for her project. So on the HMIS side, we were provided, or CASHU was provided records of HUD-funded housing services that were rendered to children and families in 3, what we refer to as continue of care, or sort of administrative geographic regions for homelessness services. So the 3 were, I'm highlighting here, text is very small, but they were Hennepin County, Ramsey County, and West Central Minnesota. Hennepin County is where Minneapolis is, and the Minneapolis metropolitan area, and Ramsey County is where St. Paul is. And then West Central Minnesota offers a much more rural population, with the furthest west region containing Moorhead, which is a city abutting Fargo in North Dakota to the west. And so we received a data poll that covered those 3 geographic regions for the years from 2013 to 2017. And then I was able to use this data to identify children who would have been considered HUD homeless by limiting that data sample to those who were in emergency shelters, transitional housing, or those who were identified through street outreach. On the other side of this big data linkage was MARS, which was the education records. And so this is a record of all public school students in Minnesota, and contains lots of information about students, including demographics, different programs that they participate in, disabilities, and then also records some outcomes that I was particularly interested in, which actually map closely onto, again, the project that Sarah was describing earlier too, which is attendance, the number of schools attended in a given year, and also standardized test proficiency. And so using that data linkage, I was able to develop an analytic sample, a sample that I was able to use to try to answer my question. And so I limited my sample to students who attended public school in one of those 3 geographic regions I showed you earlier, for which we had the HMIS data. Children who are in K through 12 in between the years from 2013 to 2014 and the 2016 to 2017 school year, which is 4 years of school data. So just a very quick details. I have a panel of data as opposed to a cross section, and so I have 455,000-ish observations of almost 200,000 unique students. So the demographics of those students I described here: 4% American Indian, 15% Asian, 18% Hispanic, 39% Black, and 24% white. So very diverse group of students. And so here's just another thing I was able to use this data to describe is the racial inequality in homelessness, which I found particularly striking. You can't quite, I mean, it's very striking for Black students, and I think immediately striking. But there's also huge disparities in the percentage of American Indian children who experience homelessness. And so Black and American Indian students were 22 and 25 times more likely to experience HUD-identified homelessness, 11 and 13 times more likely to experience ED homelessness in comparison to white students. And around 10% of American Indian and Black students experienced either type of homelessness annually. And over this 4-year period of data, 1 in 5 American Indian children experienced homelessness, and 1 in 6 Black students experienced homelessness. And this is in comparison to 1 in 50 white students. Another thing that I was able to do to describe this data is look at the prevalence of homelessness type among public school students by grade. As you can see, homelessness declines as students progress through grade, and HUD homelessness rises slightly beginning in middle school and leveling off in high school. And so these are some just descriptive visualizations I use to let you know a little bit more about this data. But to answer my question, I use, as many social scientists do, a regression analysis in order to make sense of trends in outcomes by type of homelessness. And so I include, oh, PowerPoint is not happy with me, but I'll go in the order it's coming out. So I use 3 different models of regression analysis to try to make sense of the relationship between these different types of homelessness and student outcomes. So my first model, and I'm about to present you with regression analysis, so I think it's important to just tell you what I'm showing you before I show it to you. So in my first model, I use mixed effects models with no covariates, which provides us with a between individual estimate. I'll describe what that means exactly in a second. This is why PowerPoint wasn't happy with me, because this should have come out first. But I used 3 different models, as I said, and 4 outcomes. The 4 outcomes that I am looking at are chronic absenteeism, school mobility, and this is measured as switching schools during the school year, and proficiency, just a 1 or 0 on math and reading standardized test scores. So the second model that I use is pretty much the same as the first model, but now I include covariates. So again, it's a between individual estimate, but we can think about this as controlling or holding constant differences that may be observed between these groups, such as sex, grade level, race, ethnicity, disability status, and language. English learning, limited English proficiency. That's LEP. And then finally, the third model that we use is a student fixed effects model. So this time we can consider this as a within individual estimate, in which we provide our most conservative model, in which we have fixed effects at the student level. And so for those of you who are not regression analysis friends with regression analysis, I'm just going to provide you with a little bit of language that I'm going to use in order to interpret these estimates. And this is what I meant when I said between individual estimates. So compared to students who do not experience homelessness in a given year, students who experience this type of homelessness experience X. And then when we add the covariates, compared to students who do not experience homelessness in a given year, students who experience homelessness experience X, even after controlling for other observable differences between these students. And then finally, with these student fixed effects, compared to years in which they do not experience homelessness, students experience X in the year they do experience homelessness. So again, this would be our most strict or conservative test. And so here's the first set of regression estimates. First, I just run them alone with either type of homelessness. And so here we see estimates for ed homelessness. And so these coefficients that you see here refer to the additional probability that ed homeless students will experience chronic absenteeism in the year that they experience homelessness in comparison to students who are on free lunch. And so, for example, for model 1, we would say students who experience ed homelessness have a 21% higher probability of also having chronic absenteeism in the year that they experience homelessness, in comparison to those who do not. And then you can see, so that chronic absenteeism is a significant coefficient all the way through, even with our strictest model. But you can also see that the significance of these coefficients is not always constant across these 3 models. For example, for math standard, you can see that while still negative, even in our strictest models, the coefficient is much smaller and only significant at the 0.05 level. Moving along, when we look at HUD homelessness, again, we can see that for some estimates like chronic absenteeism, there's a positive relationship between HUD homelessness and chronic absenteeism, even in our strictest models, which mean that we can feel pretty confident that students who are HUD homeless are experiencing higher rates of chronic absenteeism in comparison to their stably housed but poor peers. But again, this doesn't always hold. And in our strictest models for meeting the math standard and meeting the reading standard, we see that those coefficients are no longer significant, which would indicate to me that there might be something else going on that we haven't been able to observe in our models that's also associated with poor performance on these tests. Moving along, we can now sort of look deeper into the original research question that I presented to you all, which was what is the relative disadvantage of students who are only captured by ED's definition of homelessness in comparison to those who are captured by HUD's stricter definition of homelessness. And so now I'm presenting those in the same model, those coefficients. I'm going to take 1 second, I'm going to drink some water. Great. So now we can see, now we can draw comparisons across students who are captured by HUD's homelessness definition, and then those who are only captured by ED's homelessness definition. Many of these students we can assume are those who are doubled up. For those coefficients that are highlighted in gray, that we ran a t-test and found that those coefficients are significantly different from one another. So we can say that in our first model, chronic absenteeism for both only ED and for HUD homeless students are much higher than students who are poor but stably housed in the year that they experience homelessness. But HUD, this coefficient is even larger in a meaningful way for HUD homeless students. But then, and the same would hold again for chronic absenteeism in our second model, but doesn't hold when we move to our third model. But what we do see when we move to our third model, our most conservative, sort of strictest model, is that actually the reverse is true, that only ED homeless students actually have higher rates of school mobility, of switching school during the school year, both in comparison to HUD homeless students and in comparison to poor but stably housed peers. And then again, we do see that for meeting the math standard, meeting the reading standard, only, again, the sort of reverse is happening here, where we're seeing only ED students have significant negative association with meeting the math standard, but that is not true for HUD homeless students, and there's nothing significant for meeting the reading standard for either of these two groups. And then finally, we can sort of start to think about what is actually driving, and so this is going to get a little complicated, but we can start to think about what is actually driving those differences between ED only and the HUD homeless group. So now we've sort of split the sample into 3 different groups: a group that is only ED homeless, a group that is only HUD homeless, and the group that is in an overlapping group who are both ED and HUD homeless in the same year. So this would be students who are staying in shelters, staying in transitional shelters or emergency shelters, who are also identified by their schools as homeless. And that HUD only group would be students who aren't identified by their schools as experiencing homelessness, but do show up in data systems reporting on shelters. And what we see is that we see the largest coefficients here for students who are both HUD homeless and identified by their schools. And in some robustness tests that we do in the paper, we find that these students in this ED and HUD group have longer stays in shelter and are more likely to have longer stays in shelter, which indicates that that might be the risk factor driving those differences. So just to briefly wrap up and summarize these findings, we find that both ED and HUD identified homelessness are associated with higher rates of school mobility and chronic absenteeism in the year students experience homelessness, and this holds even in our most conservative models. And these associations are actually relatively similar in size in comparison to poor but stably housed peers. Second takeaway is actually, after accounting for unobserved individual level differences, ED identified homeless students are more likely to switch schools in the year they experience homelessness in comparison to their HUD homeless peers. And this might be signaling that ED homeless students are facing unique challenges to maintaining school enrollment and stable school enrollment in the year that they experience homelessness, above and beyond that which is experienced by HUD homeless students. And then finally, school outcomes are worse for students who are identified as homeless by HUD and are also identified and identified by their schools in the same school year. And this is true that HUD homeless students who are not identified as homeless by their schools experience relatively shorter spells of HUD homelessness, which might be driving that difference between those two groups. So the policy recommendations that we take away from the evidence that we found is that it actually would probably be very useful to establish data sharing networks between schools and HUD COCs, like that which we had available for our analysis, not only to conduct analysis, but also to communicate between two systems that aren't often communicating with each other, so that resources can be better triaged to students experiencing homelessness. Another takeaway that we take from this study is that we need to begin evaluating and documenting the housing needs of children identified as homeless in school, which we were not doing, right? As I described earlier, if you are not identified as homeless by HUD, you're screened out of whatever triage process might be going on through HUD COCs. And then finally, I think we need to increase availability and access to long-term rental assistance. As much evidence as we have suggests that is those long-term rental assistance programs directly impact a student's ability to maintain stable school enrollment and also continue to attend school consistently. And so that's what I've got for you all today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Warren. So we will now do the same thing in terms of Q&A. If you have a question for Warren, you can feel free to click on that raise hand icon and I'll call on you and you can ask your question out loud, or if you'd be more comfortable putting your question in the chat, I'm happy to read out questions from the chat. And while you all are thinking about that, I will take the moderator's prerogative and ask the first question, which is, Warren, it seems like this result about comparing outcomes for those who are identified by their schools as being homeless and those identified by HUD makes me question and that the effect on school mobility is larger for those identified by schools. Makes me wonder about what schools are doing with the information that they gather when they identify students as homeless. I thought the main purpose of that was to help them stay at their current school. So can you talk a little bit about what you think is going on there?
Yeah, so I think there are forces working against each other here. And this paper is under review and we got a question from a reviewer, which was very similar to this, which was like, does this mean that this policy isn't working? Because exactly what you're saying, that you receive customized transportation, you're supposed to when you are identified by your schools. I think what's one thing that's happening here is that there's a large variability in who is going to take you in when you're doubled up and where you go.
Right.
And I think that and this is again just conjecturally from my experience working in shelters in Minneapolis, is actually that transportation is like really well covered at shelters. There's a bus that will come to the shelter and pick everyone up and take you to the school. And that's not going to be the case when you are staying with a family member or relative. And I think also to the extent that you might be bouncing around from place to place more, whatever customized transportation you try to get set up is then going to have a difficult time transitioning to whatever the next place is that you're staying. So I think those two competing forces result in this higher rate of school instability.
Thanks. Marcos.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Warren. Warren, I'm going to ask a question that is less fun than Anna's, but is related to exactly the same topic. It's related to my obsession with measurement. Because one may imagine that part of what you capture with the strong relationship between classification at the school level and school mobility is actually the measurement by schools of homelessness, right? So there may be something about how this is coded into the system. Maybe those folks that are switching schools are the ones that are updating their information about being homeless or not. I think it's important to think about how does information get to be recorded before it gets to your hands.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point, and a lot of that still is a black box to us. I think again, what a reviewer had a comment that was very similar to yours. Originally, we were sort of describing these groups as, HUD defined homelessness and Ed defined homelessness, and we were encouraged to start referring to these groups, and had to meticulously change this in the paper as being HUD identified and Ed identified, and that sort of doesn't solve the issue of measurement, but I think like cleans our hands of sort of putting on a definition that might not be, there's all sorts of issues with measurement. And as long as we're saying these are just the ones that are identified, these are the associations, I think we have a little bit of a cleaner interpretation.
Jane.
Yeah, thanks, Warren. This is awesome. I've heard so much about this paper in brief snippets, so it's great to see the full paper. I was going to ask a similar question on the HUD side. Like, how does one become identified by HUD?
Right. So for the most part, families reach out to HUD when they need help with housing. And then there's a triage that happens. Again, conjecturally, from my understanding, one of the first things HUD, and it's this huge geographic variation, so this is just what people have told me, but from my understanding, one of the first things that HUD will ask is, do you have someone that you can stay with? Do you have someone that you can go to that will house you, because resources are so limited? I think that's a lot of the time what ends up with people doubling up, is that they say, yes, I do have someone that I can stay with. And folks say, well, go stay with them. And I think, so is there some sort of black box happening there too, where people are selecting into shelters or selecting out of shelters? And there's a lot of qualitative research on that, but that's my understanding, is it starts with a phone call. And sometimes, of course, these are also referrals that come from a physician, or they could come up from a DSS agent. And so I think, it's a good question, that there's a lot of selection that goes in there too that we can't quite capture.
But to follow up, Warren, in the HMIS system, the families who are identified are only those where HUD then provided services. So if they said, do you have someone you could stay with? And the person said, yeah, I guess I can call my sister. And then they do, and they stay with the sister, then HUD doesn't have a record of that happening that you are able to observe. Is that right? Yes,
that is exactly correct. I was fumbling with my answer, but yes, that is exactly correct. Is that we are only observing services rendered.
Right.
And so to the extent that, and because HUD's definition closely matches with the services that they are providing, especially for families where a huge portion of children and families experiencing homelessness are those in shelters, I think that measurement is pretty true. We do miss folks who are staying in domestic violence shelters, because that data is not shared. And we do miss, there's sort of one shelter who's not receiving HUD funding, and so they don't have to report to HUD. It's a small percentage of the folks experiencing homelessness in Minneapolis, from my understanding. But yeah, otherwise, I think we're capturing pretty much everyone experiencing HUD homelessness.
Other questions for Warren? Any broader questions, reflections, comments, takeaways that people would like to share. Again, I encourage you to click on that raise hand icon if you want to share your reflections or ask broader questions out loud, or I'm happy to read them from the chat if you'd feel more comfortable typing them into the chat. Warren or Sarah, do either of you have any reflections that you would like to make?
I just got a question from Sharon asking about the name of the data set that we're using in our research, and it's the NCERDC. So I'd be happy to share the link to that page in case you're interested in knowing more about it.
Well, it is a beautiful late spring day here in North Carolina. For those of you who are local, perhaps you'd like to get out and enjoy the sun. If folks would like to stick around for any informal conversation, I think those of us involved in these projects would be happy to stay on for a few minutes. Carabano has just put a link to the NCERDC data in the chat. Thank you so much, Kara, for doing that. For those of you who are interested in learning more about what is available here in North Carolina, I encourage you to click on that link and take a look. A huge thank you today to Erica Lako, the events coordinator at the Center for Child and Family Policy, who does so much work behind the scenes and is just a humongous help in so many ways, and was incredibly flexible and adaptable as we moved this event from a hybrid event to an online only. And I just want to give Erica a huge, huge round of applause and say thank you so much, as always, for your support, Erica. Well, thanks to all of you for being here. I think those of us involved will stick around briefly. Feel free to log off and enjoy the sun if you're here in North Carolina. And hopefully we'll see you at future Center for Child and Family Policy events soon. Thanks for being here.